You know, Penny, I did some nighttime reading, and I have to tell you, it was very, very depressing. You helped co-author a report called The Work Ahead. Here's the paper version of this. And I have to say, I found myself thinking that this was the sort of most blunt, straightforward, no-holds-barred report about the skills gap and the difficulty of training workforces for this 21st century economy, which clearly is the #1 issue facing CEOs, entrepreneurs, everybody, you know, obviously the workers. But I want to read just two quick stats here. 80% of US households saw their incomes fall in the decade after 2005. 80% of US households saw their incomes fall in the decade after 2005, even as costs for necessities like education, housing, and healthcare rose. And the second one is, as many as 1/3 of American workers may need to change occupations and acquire new skills by 2030 if we just follow the path we are. So obviously, my first question is, did this report keep you up at night as much as me? And what do we do about it?
It did, but I think it's really important that all of us are aware. I think there's an opportunity here, but I also think there's a real threat to all of us in our businesses if we don't wake up and realize that most Americans are struggling to adapt to automation, to artificial intelligence, and to globalization. And we're seeing that politically, but put aside the political issues, let's just look at the economic challenges. You and I were talking about the number of CEOs that we've talked to. As Secretary of Commerce, there wasn't a CEO that I talked to, and I talked to about 2,300 during my tenure, and who said that one of their top 3 issues was their ability to find a skilled labor force that can help them grow their businesses. They have opportunities, but they can't find the people to execute it. And that's a real problem for our country. And we're not helping Americans adapt to this change. The change that we're all excited about, the change I'm embracing, Bradley's embracing, all of us here are embracing. But most Americans are really fearful. 75% of them would say they fear for their incomes for themselves or their family members. And you know, that kind of fear is not good for any of us.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's absolutely true that, you know, I talk to CEOs all the time. My colleagues do every day. We talk to CEOs, and the #1 thing they talk about is this mismatch between the workforce they have and the skills that they need. But the other part, Bradley, is, you know, this a sudden fear of technology. And you even hear technologists, you know, leading technologists talk about the fear of AI and some of the unknowableness of it. In your world, I mean, you're dealing with a lot of these startup entrepreneurs, but do you see more of a fear happening?
I mean, I think that, like a lot of things in American society now, everything gets really polarized, right? So you have people who say, this is all bad, it's all scary, the robots are going to take over. And you'll say, no, this is all wonderful. Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg always seem to be fighting about that issue. Where in reality, it's a little bit of both. So like, for example, automated trucking is an industry that we invest in and work in. And on one hand, once you hit full automation, there will be less need for truckers. On the flip side, lots of other jobs will need to be fulfilled that don't exist right now for the same reasons. And rather than saying it's all bad or it's all good, or the Teamsters just opposing it, or Silicon Valley just saying we have to have it at all costs, I think everyone kind of sat down and said, look, here's what we need today, here's what we'll need in 5 years, here's what we'll need in 15 years, and here's how we provide the training and nutrition and whatever else we need to do to get there. A lot of these things are more solvable problems than people realize.
I think one of the opportunities that exists in there is really, how do you make the skills demands of a job more transparent to the job seekers? So how do you make that pathway more clear to the family or the individual who's trying to figure out, how do I become a cybersecurity expert? How do I become an expert in artificial intelligence and machine learning? And these are not career paths that are obvious to many, many, many people or families. And so there you've got companies started like Journeys, where you can plot here I am, I'm a 10th grader and I want to work in one of Bradley's companies. How do I get there? Right. What's my pathway to become an expert in autonomous vehicles so that I could, you know, find myself in a career? There's also something the BRT started, the Business Roundtable, called Credential Engine that makes credentials more transparent to companies. So if I go out and I either take a course online, I take a course at a community college, or I have a university background, what is that training and what's the value to an employer of that training?
So there are things that companies themselves can do, and working in concert with one another, as in BRT or the Fortune CEO Initiative, which we're very proud of, and others. But there are certain specific tech policy changes at the government level that we kind of have to deal with in order to solve issues of portability and mobility and true ability to carry with you benefits, for example. And so how do we start to deal with those?
Well, in the report, what we've done is we've basically recognized this is sort of a do report as opposed to, I'm going to call it an academic report. And so the audiences are your governors, your mayors, your business leaders, your NGOs, and to some extent the federal government. But really the actions at the states, and I mean, Bradley, you live this every day with your companies. The other opportunity is the business opportunity, which is, you take, there's companies that are providing training online through gaming, and that are, making a huge difference in terms of cost savings, in terms of, people making mistakes in their work. So there's a lot of different types of opportunities here. So it's not to be all depressing, but if we don't wake up and pay attention to this, we as a country will be less competitive.
And there is more happening, I think, at the state and local level than people probably realize. Unlike the federal government, which can kind of get away with not necessarily acting, or at least Congress can, states have to pass a balanced budget every year, which means something has to kind of be the final product at the end of the session. And therefore, tech policy does move in one direction or another, right? So portable benefits, which Penny's report really argues so compellingly for, is something that we've worked on behalf of a lot of our portfolio companies in the sharing economy in state houses all over the country. And you see things evolve. I mean, I just think back to when we started working on the politics of ride sharing with Uber back in, say, 2011, to doing the exact same thing with Bird today and scooters, and perceptions have changed. Like the same politicians who 7, 8 years ago kind of scoffed at us until we got 50,000 of their constituents to email them, and then they kind of backed down, now understand that's coming, and they're dealing with it in a more sophisticated way. Sometimes that's bad for me because I can't always roll them, but oftentimes it's good.
You can't always roll them. You have one of the best, most unusual business models. I mean, you actually invest in companies that actually have regulatory problems or government issues.
Yeah.
Which is kind of, I mean, a lot of people look for the opposite. They look, oh, where's the smooth sailing?
Right. We embrace the chaos. We will only invest in startups in regulated industries with political problems, and most of the time we're then working with those companies as well to solve them.
So and both of you, obviously, as Secretary of Commerce, and both of you have started 10 companies between you, and you've obviously developed and built companies. You know what it's like in terms of the regulatory framework and trying to change things. How do you go about it? How do you change the playbook? So what's the first thing you do in order to try to get a critical mass of people that say, all right, we need these programs that we know work, that the BRT supports, all the business community supports, and yet for some reason, to use a phrase that I know you love, we have this failure to adjust. We can't possibly get it going. What do you do first?
Well, I think you have to begin by, first of all, explaining to the political infrastructure the reality of what's happening. I mean, it's like what Bradley was talking about. Change is happening whether government wants to embrace it or not. Privacy is an issue whether government's going to do anything about it or not. And so, or you're going to have different types of ride sharing than just taxis or buses, if you will. And so, it begins with explaining the demographic and market realities to your political audience. And the same is true for, if you took a governor and you said to a governor, look, you are not maximizing your opportunity to attract new economic activity in your state. And here's a roadmap. And that's what this report is. It's a roadmap that says, here's a menu of things that you can do in order to, embrace the fact that your workforce needs training, needs more lifelong learning, and needs more clarity as to how to be active in the industries that are thriving within your state, you get a governor's attention pretty fast.
Yeah. We're going to go to some questions. So if you've got some questions, please think about them and then indicate it to a paddler. Raise your hand, and then we can get one. We've got one over there in a second. Okay, I don't see one yet, but let's talk about immigration, because that's one of those big stumbling block issues. It's a political, it's sort of untenable on both sides for many people. But right now in Silicon Valley, there are ads paid for by Prime Minister Trudeau saying, hey, you got trouble with your H-1B visa? Pivot to Canada. I mean, there are other countries that we're competing with that seem to want to solve these problems, right? So how do we even begin to deal with the immigration issue from a trade standpoint?
Well, I think the first question is we have to clarify for the what the American people want, because I think it's been completely muddied. Americans want our legal immigration system to work, and they want strong border security against illegal immigration. And I think we've been making this a false choice and mixing the whole thing up, as opposed to saying, how do we deal? We really have to, from a moral and ethical standpoint, deal with the 11 million people who live here today, who came here illegally, many of whom are young people who came not because of their own volition, but through their parents. I know we make a big deal about what's going on right this minute. The truth is, illegal immigration into this country is not huge. We have a population that's here that we need to deal with. That's one. Two is, then I think there's also political will to deal with high-skilled immigration, H-1B visas, the spouses of H-1B visa holders. I mean, it's crazy to say, you can't, we'll give your spouse an H-1B visa, you get an H-1B visa, but the spouse can't work in the United States. That doesn't work. Right. And you're absolutely right. I was in Toronto recently. Toronto is growing at 1% a year. I don't know what your cities are like, but I'll tell you, Chicago would like to grow at 1%. I'm talking population 1% a year. It's a smart immigration policy. We should embrace something like that. And if you look at the polling and really get the politics out of it, Americans want legal immigration to work well.
So Bradley, you have a plan to get people to actually help put in place some of these common sense ideas, and that's to get them to vote. Yep. And so talk a little bit about this because it's so critical to all of it.
Yeah, so we have an initiative through our family foundation that promotes mobile voting. And we just conducted the first election over blockchain in the West Virginia primary May 8th. It was available to deployed military in Afghanistan.
You sort of glossed over that over blockchain. I think that's kind of it.
So the idea is it's a way to both make voting more widely available, because you can do it on your phone, but far safer than the status quo as well. Given that election security is such a big issue right now, we think we've identified one way to solve both problems in one shot.
Are people talking about that election security? Is that a big issue?
I think I heard one or two things about it. I'm not sure. But yeah, fundamentally, I spent a long time in politics, and the vast majority of politicians, and this is not going to shock anyone in this audience, are basically making choices that directly impact the next election. And the inputs they're given directly determine the outputs we get. So for as long as, say, take immigration, in a typical congressional Republican primary, turnout is 12%, a huge number of those voters are going to be very hardline on illegal immigration, and therefore it doesn't make political sense for Republicans in Congress, a lot of them, to be flexible, do the kind of policies that Penny just talked about. But if it were 60% turnout, because you just had to press a button on your phone instead of finding a random place on a Tuesday, all of a sudden the politics change dramatically, the dynamics change dramatically, and I believe most politicians will just adapt to whatever they have to adapt to stay in office. And so the question is, will people actually vote if it's easy? And what I have found in our work with companies like Uber and FanDuel is that people who are apathetic and normally don't vote in elections, if you give them a compelling message and you let them do it from their phone in an app, they will advocate. So you can turn them out, and you could therefore totally impact the way that politicians deal with issues like guns or climate or immigration or really any hard issue we have. I think Penny's point earlier is right. Most Americans agree on immigration. Most Americans agree on most hard issues. The problem is most Americans don't vote in political primaries, and those who do are here and here, and they control the agenda.
All right, let's get a question. We want to have one right over there. Tell us who you are.
Yes, hi, Tony Cole from Ativo Networks. So it's really interesting. You talk about the issues with not getting enough young people interested in STEM-like programs to fill those big gaps. I have a young grandson who's in kindergarten, and he's doing Code to the Future. So can't read and write yet, just learning it, and doing block-based coding, so on Swift from MIT. How do we get programs like that into rural America, and also into inner cities where kids are touching technology for the first time, touching technology for the first time, when they get into school? How do we actually expand that program and expand the pool of candidates?
First thing we have to do is get high-speed broadband to the rural population. We still have 25% of Americans in rural America who do not have high-speed internet, and we all know the cost of that to every aspect of your life. So that's the first thing that we have to do. And then we have to, it has to become, I believe this is state by state. We're going to have to take this fight, which is to really expand technology. Technology is available in most public schools. The question is how it's embraced and how early kids are embracing technology. It's interesting enough, I was sat on the school board in Chicago, one of the hardest things I've ever done. And what was interesting is the teachers and the teachers' unions embraced the technology because what was happening is outcomes were improving. And so they were being rewarded because they had better outcomes.
Yeah. So we got one question over there, and then we'll go to this one right here. Yeah.
Hi, Michael Chewy from the McKinsey Global Institute. Penny, you've described this as a matter of country competitiveness as well. And Clifton, you've talked about this, the immigration. The report is actually from the Council on Foreign Relations. Would love to hear some ideas of the countries we're competing with and what some of them are doing.
It's a great question, yeah.
Well, you're exactly right. You might ask, why did the Council on Foreign Relations do this report? They view it as an issue of national security, because our economic security depends on, our national security depends on our economic security. The countries that are doing some of the most interesting things, I think, are, we'll take Europe, because that's a model more similar to us. There's an incredible embracing of linkage between education and a job and work. Today, in the United States, there's enormous friction between the education system and actually being ready for work. We're very much for, and I'm not against four-year colleges at all. It's just we need to make it easier for someone to gain information and skills and workforce training to be able to get into the workforce. The second is apprenticeships. And you're seeing a national initiative, and this administration is embracing it, to take the number of apprenticeships in this country up to 5 million. We should absolutely be at that number. And today we're about 800,000, to give you an idea. And we should take apprenticeships into white-collar work. And that's happening in, Chicago is experimenting. We have Aon and Accenture have come together with about 20 other companies to experiment with working with folks from our more low-income communities into white-collar apprenticeships. Germany, the best countries doing this are Switzerland, Germany, Denmark. Are great role models that we can adapt what they're doing to our system.
Okay, great. We've got a question over there, and then we'll go right to the far right. Okay, there you go. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Carla Monteroso. I'm CEO at Code 2040. For the last decade, 15 to 22% of all computer science graduates have been Black and Latino, and that is definitely not the representation that is had in the tech industry. And I was wondering if you could speak to what companies should be doing to take advantage of the actual available talent pool we currently have. And I find that that is also clear for rural America and places where people are trained and are not getting hired.
Yeah, I think that to a certain extent, it's a question of will, right? So as a VC, one of the things I always have to remind our team is white men are not the entirety of the consumer marketplace. And if that's the only perspective we look at it from, we're going to get this wrong. And then I kind of called bullshit on myself and said, okay, I had to fill 2 roles in the investment team. I said, we're only hiring women. And you know what? We found amazing people who were probably better than we would have found otherwise. And so I really think that if companies actually did set, and I know President Trump wouldn't like this, but I really do think if companies set some form of quotas and said, we want to make sure that our workforce is representative of the country as a whole, and we are just going to make sure these are our hires. I've found from my own experience that it works, and I've seen that in some of my portfolio companies too.
I'd love to just come back to just this issue that you talked about, Germany and Switzerland and Finland. They do something called flex security, where they not just paying their unemployment benefits, but they actually help train you through the process and stay with you until you get your new job. Is that something that you could see us doing?
Yeah, but I think it's going to have to happen in a state. And you're going to there's going to be a governor who says, you know what, I want to be more competitive. At the end of the day, I think this is all about economic competitiveness.
Right.
And I think we have to have a multi-dimensional economic competitiveness plan. And I think that the innovative governor who says, I'm going to take this on, Gina Raimondo has taken this on in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
You know, but I think we're going to have 31 new governors by January, at least 31. And this is an opportunity for them to, you know, they're all looking to make a difference and make their states more competitive. But what happens is it is a partnership between business and the employee and the government. And that's the thing that has to function appropriately. And it's got to function at the speed, frankly, that business needs.
And business now seems to get it. I mean, this is, I mean, you know, Alan talks about this in the CEO Daily. I mean, this is something that, you know, everybody is getting, that this we need to retrain this workforce. Yeah.
But there's got to be more tolerance for failure, right? So if you look at New Orleans, after Katrina, they radically redid their school system. They made it all charter. They changed the dynamics, and outcomes have succeeded dramatically. But they took a real risk, because if they had failed, you know, the media and the teachers union would have sort of nailed them to the wall and said, see, we told you this doesn't work. Lots of ideas aren't going to work, because human nature is hard, and government is hard, and government has limited effectiveness. And I think on all sides of it, we're so quick to condemn whoever tries something new for failing because it doesn't fit our ideology, that people are afraid to innovate, they're afraid to try, and you don't have as much experimentation as you could to solve these problems.
And we have changed our school systems in the past, from the agrarian to the industrial society. We've changed our school systems. And so this is something we can do. Yeah. Well, with that, I want to thank our two extraordinary guests, Penny Pritzker and Bradley Tuss. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, that was awesome. Thank you so much.